Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's been a year full of labor unrest in the transportation industry. But this one has the potential to top them all.
Air Canada is finalizing plans to suspend several flights as soon as Sunday. The decision was made to cancel most of the operations in preparation of a potential pilot strike.
The deadline for an Air Canada pilot strike is not for another week. But already, passengers are scrambling to rebook flights, and the airline is saying that it may start canceling flights as early as this weekend, days ahead of the strike deadline. Why so early? Well, maybe they remember when their competitor WestJet went through the same thing earlier this year. It didn't go so well.
I'm hanging in nowhere right now with two boys. We don't know what to do, and Germany's on the other side of the planet. So
now Air Canada is much, much bigger than WestJet. It's the largest carrier in the country by a mile. Tens of thousands of people fly every day on their planes. What happens when those planes just don't fly? And why has this year seen so many transport disruptions? On rails, in airports, and at ports in Canada and the United States. What's changed? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. John Gradek is an aviation industry expert. He is a faculty lecturer and program coordinator in supply chain logistics and operations management at McGill University. He joins us from the side of the road in his car. He's one of our favorite people to talk to when transportation in this country is in danger of breaking down, John.
My pleasure to be here with you, Jordan.
Why don't you set us up by giving us a bit of context about Air Canada as everybody frets about a possible upcoming work stoppage? Like, what percentage of Canada's airline industry does this company make up?
I'd say Air Canada is about 40 to 45% of the Canadian aviation capacity. You know, it's number one by a fair degree. Number two is WestJet. Number three, probably Porter Airlines at this point in time. And then Flair holding up the top four.
If I had to ask you just off the top, and we'll get into the details of it, to describe what kind of problem an Air Canada shutdown would cause in Canada, what would you describe it as?
Oh, I'd say it's major. It's an inconvenience. It would be something where you have, I would say, somewhere in a range of 100 to 110,000 passengers a day that have trips planned on Air Canada. So it's not insignificant. It is something that those passengers who are booked on Air Canada have a high level of anxiety today. They're probably getting emails and messages from Air Canada because Air Canada has already started to look at potentially canceling flights in preparation for a strike. So they're getting emails advising them, here are your options. Your flight's probably going to get canceled. We don't know when, but here are some of the options to be available, and we'll let you know if and when the flights actually do get canceled.
You mentioned 100 to 110,000 people a day. In terms of the Air Canada workforce themselves, how many workers are we talking about here? And if you can, summarize for us what the issues are here that's threatening a strike.
Well, I think what you're seeing happen here is, one group of employees, which are the pilots, that have a new union that's representing them. They turfed the previous union, which was the Air Canada Pilots Association. So this is a new union that's representing these pilots. There are 5,200 pilots. If the pilots, are on strike, for all intents and purposes, Air Canada is shut down.
What happens to the rest of the workers at Air Canada if the pilots go on strike? Are they still getting paid? What are they doing?
Yeah, Air Canada is going to be looking at taking some layoff notices fairly quickly to the other unionized employees that are part of their operations branch. So you've got flight attendants, you've got mechanics, you've got ground service workers. So if the flights aren't going, Air Canada will be looking at somehow minimizing its costs and looking to see if they can, in fact, put these individuals on layoff status pending the resolution of this strike or lockout that they may have with the pilots.
So the deadline for this labor dispute is the 18th of September, which is still a week away here. So why are, as you mentioned, people already hearing about their flights potentially being canceled as early as this weekend and being told to make arrangements now? Like, this is a fair buffer usually for a labor dispute.
It is. I think that, we saw this same phenomenon happen with the WestJet labor issues that they were having with their pilots earlier this year, where WestJet, in fact, took action, I think 3 or 4 days before the actual threat of a strike to, in fact, start canceling flights in anticipation of a strike, because you're looking at, trying to make sure that your operations, and your flights, your aircraft and your staff are not stranded. So when you have the airplanes that are going around the world, as Air Canada has, you're looking at making sure that if and when the strike does happen, that the airplanes and the crews are in a secure location. And so if there's a issue about location that's causing Air Canada grief, Air Canada would in fact not dispatch an airplane to those locations a few days before the strike actually happens, so that people are not stranded and the equipment's not stranded.
So this is where it gets interesting, and this is why we called you, because that process sounds really complex. Can you kind of walk us through the actual logistics of shutting down like the entire Air Canada operation? What does that look like on the ground in practice?
Yeah, it is complex. You basically have to look at each and every single flight that, is scheduled to operate, as of the strike date, September 18th, which is the tentative date that Air Canada has set. So anything that's operating, it's in the air as of that time, will get to land wherever they happen to be the first stop for that aircraft to land. So there's no risk to the passengers or the airplanes when the strike gets called. But once the airplane lands, the pilots walk off. And from that perspective, you'd rather have these pilots walk off at their home base. You'd rather, you'd rather not have these pilots walk off in Dubai or in Singapore or in Bangkok or, in Casablanca. So Air Canada is looking at what's it going to take for us to make sure that by the time we get to a potential lockout or strike on the 1st of September, where are our people? Where are our airplanes? And, what is it that we have to do to make sure that when the strike or lockout does happen, they're safe? And so that will require the airline to cancel flights that are planned to operate before the strike or lockout date, and to make sure that operation, that flight, and those crews are not sent out on their mission, because the odds of them making it back are not good.
Let's talk about what passengers are experiencing. As you mentioned, right now, they're probably getting emails about a potential cancellation of their flight. In a couple of days, even, they could start getting emails that their flight has been canceled. What options do they have? And what kind of compensation are they entitled to here if this goes down?
Well, Air Canada has been very, very upfront in telling passengers that once your flight is canceled, you have options, including refunds. So Air Canada will look at refunding your ticket once a flight has been declared canceled, and you're on your own. After that, if you have a trip that was planned, there is no requirement by Air Canada to, in fact, book you on another flight. You have to fend for yourself in making sure that you have, your trip protected on your own.
So they got to go and look for another airline themselves and then pay for that ticket themselves as well.
That's correct. The question is, how fast is Air Canada going to refund you?
Right.
Am I going to wait 6 months to get a refund, or am I going to get the refund in 10 or 15 days? That's an interesting question that has yet to be answered by Air Canada. But, in terms of other compensation, we have the air passenger protection rights that are out there that do cover flights that are delayed or canceled in normal operations during the schedule. And there is compensation. If the flight is canceled and it's out of the airline's control, there is no compensation. But in this case, I think Air Canada and the Canadian Transportation Agency have concluded that this is an event that is outside the airline's control, and that there would be no compensation provided by the carriers other than just a refund of the ticket.
And what about the rest of, and I'm assuming this is covered by what you just mentioned, but I got to ask it because I know a lot of people, and I've heard this mentioned, book holiday packages, right? That include your Air Canada flight, but also lock you into a hotel or a rental car or whatever else it is. People are just on the hook for those.
One of the things we're always talking about in the industry is to ensure that when you buy these packages or these tours, that you also buy insurance. The insurance side of it, is basically your protection for this type of eventuality. As long as your insurance policy has coverage for it. But, that's probably the only saving grace that you'll get out of this one, is to look for insurance coverages.
You mentioned the WestJet strike, and I know that lasted like just a couple of days, but it still managed to shut down a ton of flights and strand people in Canada and other countries. Do you think there were lessons learned from that Air Canada will use now?
Well, I think what you see happening with Air Canada is a little different than what happened with WestJet, is that Air Canada has taken the initiative to let passengers know that, there is a potential for disruption, that, there is something that's going to be sent to you at the time of a cancellation. It's like the cancellations are not going to be a surprise, that, you should expect communication from Air Canada. And I think that whole process is a little different than what we had when WestJet was going through its machinations with its pilots. So I think Air Canada has learned a lesson from the WestJet fiasco and is trying to manage it a little differently. I'm not sure whether, in fact, Air Canada, is looking at a strike or is looking at a lockout. I'm not sure how that's all going to work out. But yeah, there has been lessons learned. I think Air Canada is applying it.
In general, why has there been so much labor unrest in the airline industry specifically, but also just in transportation in general? We saw a rail work action just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think this is a situation of Air Canada's own design. Air Canada back in the mid-2010s, 2013, 2014, had some issues with respect to its financial viability. And they decided one of their answers was to, in fact, go into these long-term contracts with their employee groups so that they would minimize any disruption to the airline. So they entered into 10-year contracts in 2014 with the pilots, in 2015 with the flight attendants. And the price they paid was labor peace for 10 years. Now the crows have come home to roost, and you're paying a price for that 10-year contract now. And so that's what's going on with Air Canada. That, would they repeat this 10-year contract deal again? I don't think so. I think the unions kind of got their lesson taught to them, and Air Canada as well. So I think that we've seen the last of these long-term agreements. We're back to a 3 or 4 year agreement at the most. And that should, come up with fixing the problem with the airline industry. But transportation in general, is having a problem. There's a lot of things going on in transportation in terms of collective agreements that are expiring. People have gone through COVID, have gone through layoffs, have gone through salary freezes, salary reductions, and the industry across various modes are looking to catch up. So whether you're talking about the BC port strike, the Montreal port strike, you're talking about CN, CPKC, you're talking about WestJet, you're talking about Air Canada, even talking Air Transat. Transportation seems to be in the bullseye for organized labor to kind of catch up on wages and to make sure that people understand that they are an integral part of the supply chain. The supply chains are important to keep economic stability in our country, and the unions are taking advantage of that. But it's not just in Canada. The U.S. East Coast ports are facing a strike on October 1st that would shut down 77 ports in the U.S. And the provision for those ports is that they're looking for are you sitting down? 77% wage increase.
Wow.
So yeah, they were all catching up, and I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done to kind of press the reset button in terms of making sure we somehow have labor peace and that we have collective agreements that reflect the actual needs of organized labor as well as the operators.
Is part of this because they're pressing their advantage because during COVID, I think the general public learned a lot more rapidly about how integral these folks are to the supply chain and the transportation chain. And now, the public has a better understanding of where they fit into all this.
Yeah, there is. And, I think that, you go back to the pilots for a few minutes and just talk about, how this thing kind of got to where it's at. There is a pilot shortage in North America. I would say even globally. The manufacturers are producing tons and tons, thousands of airplanes, and there's not enough pilots to get these airplanes flying. So the larger carriers are very concerned about getting the pilot resources and retaining the pilot resources they need. And their answer has been to increase wages and to pay more than anybody else, so that they have the ability to retain their pilots in this case. So Delta, American, United signed massive wage increases over the last 18 to 24 months, ranging from 35 to 45% wage increases as a means of retaining people, retaining pilots. And that has a cascading effect, and we're seeing that cascading effect very much both in the WestJet negotiations earlier this year and very much so now with Air Canada.
When we talk about Air Canada, if this strike happens, is there a role for the government to play here? I realize that's a kind of a delicate question to ask, but obviously it is a huge part of the infrastructure. You mentioned almost 50% of our airline capacity.
Yeah, it's an issue that we have to somehow deal with. The question is, what's the government's role in labor negotiations and in collective bargaining? What I see happening is that there seems to be, in my opinion, an abdication on the part of management to be willing to negotiate, because they know that the government will step in and will in fact take action in spite of the fact that negotiations have been slow. So we saw that with the WestJet pilots. We saw that most definitively with the WestJet mechanics. Very obvious with the rail strike that, there was, in my opinion, an abdication of willingness to negotiate on the part of management. And they're saying, well, this doesn't really matter. We're going to get either binding arbitration or back to work legislation. So let's not sweat it. We'll get a public outcry. So, the country was in crisis, economic crisis with a rail strike, and the government took action. 18 hours after the strike was launched, it was over. But with Air Canada, there is no economic urgency. There is no national emergency. There is no crisis that we have to deal with, because we do have competition, thank you very much, in Canada that have flying 200 some odd airplanes. And as far as I'm concerned, there is going to be inconvenience for sure. Those 110,000 passengers a day are going to get inconvenience, and it's going to cost them more. But that's the game that's being played between management and union. And Air Canada is not recognizing, its need to ante up to meet the union requirements, because they're saying that government's going to legislate us back to work anyway. So no big deal.
If this strike does happen and continues for some time, like, you mentioned again, 100,000 people a day, how does that compound day after day? I mean, we saw WestJet, which didn't even really have a work stoppage, still took like a couple of weeks to get back up to full strength. Like, what kind of, I don't know if chaos is the right term, but what kind of mess would it cause if this strike happens and goes for a week and then continues?
Yeah, I'll use the term chaos. It's okay. It is going to be chaos. And it's going to take at least a couple of weeks for Canada to get back into some shape or form of its current self. It's going to take them a couple of weeks to get their act together. The other carriers in Canada will try as much as they can to supplement their services, but it's going to take at least 10 days to 2 weeks to come back.
Last question then. What do you wish we all understood better, the public understood better about this whole labor issue in the airline industry, or with Air Canada particularly? What do we not know that we need to?
This is an issue in transportation that has been, on the back burner for years, if not decades. That, who has control of the destiny of, employees in the airline industry. And it is a fundamental issue that I think Air Canada and the unions are coming to grips with. That, when you talk about who has the final say in terms of making sure that workers' rights are being recognized and being acted upon. And I think that that's where we have to somehow, some way, really change our labor relations practices and our labor negotiation practices to recognize that, the conundrum that we're facing in Canada in transportation is serious, that, the collective bargaining process that we have probably needs to get retuned to something else. The current process isn't working, as we can see, in various domains, but we do need to have somehow, some way recognition that supply chains are very, very critical to the success of the country. We can't afford to have all of these supply chain interruptions happen because it affects our credibility in world trade. So we need a new mechanism to kind of figure out how do we negotiate without causing all of this chaos, as we say, in the supply chains and in air transportation.
John, thank you so much for this. And speaking of transportation chaos, I will let you get back in your car before you get pulled over by the cops. And thanks again for spending some time with us.
I think they called for a tow truck, which is cool. All right. No, I'll be okay.
Take care.
Have a good one.
John Gradek of McGill University, hopefully not getting a ticket right now. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can always shoot us your feedback on this episode or any other by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us. 416-935-5935 is the number, and leaving us a message. The Big Story is available on every single podcast player in the world, and that now includes Seeker, Seekr. You should check it out if you haven't. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.